Greetings and welcome to another episode of the eLearning Faculty Perspective. I'm Ben Whitmore and this is Tim McKean. And today we are graciously welcomed by Erin Huebener, SEC Spanish faculty, and Angela Rasmussen, SEC Teaching and Learning Coordinator. Welcome, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we're excited to have you guys here. This month we are talking about transparency framework and what that means in assignment design and course design in general. And so we have some faculty that are very experienced in that, or at least more than we are, so we thought it'd be handy to bring them in and ask you guys a few questions. To get started off the top, how did you get started with TILT or transparency design? What inspired you to get into it?
Well, I attended a training at the Teaching and Learning Center with Angela, and during which she gave us a really nice overview of what the TILT or transparency framework can achieve for closing the achievement gap within student populations. And I thought that it was something that my students would likely really benefit from. And I started with one assignment. And then once I had that assignment in place, it was very easy for me to transfer over to others. But it all started here in the TLC. Yeah.
And for me, it was just a little bit before that, because I had honestly attended a workshop then at a conference led by Marianne Winklemas, who's the sort of TILT in higher ed kind of guru at this moment. And it was just amazing to see how transformative changing just a small aspect of an assignment could be. So it wasn't even 6 months later that we did our first TILT workshop here, or transparency framework workshop in the TLC. And I was just really amazed at how much not only all students benefited from transparent assignments, but how incredibly important it was for the sort of non-traditional kinds of students, the underperforming students, first generation, low income, and the kind of underserved populations, how much better they did than just anybody else. So it was one of the first things that I saw that really had a potential for closing that achievement gap that we see with so many students, and it made me really excited and wanted to come back and share it. And it's kind of become my answer for any question. When people say, what do new faculty need to know? I'm like, ooh, transparency. When people say, how can I get my students better engaged, or how can I get them to do better? Transparency seems to now be the answer for just about everything, which I know I need to come up with more answers than just one, but at the moment it's my personal favorite. So.
But it's very flexible. I think it can be adapted to fit any number of situations.
Can you describe the basic components of this framework?
Mm-hmm. How about I start? The basic framework is really about not only telling students what they're supposed to do, the sort of typical task of an assignment, but also why they're doing it, explaining the sort of knowledge, skills, and abilities that they're supposed to be gaining out of it, and also how they know they're doing it well. So that sort of three-part that I think faculty do a really good job with the what, the task itself. We already have those on our assignments. I just don't think we hear very often now of people not handing out assignment sheets, or this sort of kind of wandering due dates and coverage and evaluative criteria. I think people tend to kind of give students a good idea about how they're supposed to do well, but we don't always formalize that, and we really don't always articulate why students are supposed to be doing assignments. And in this age of not only knowing what good assignments are for adult learners, really how to reach them and engage them, specifically telling them what they're doing and what it's supposed to bring for them, getting them on board personally with it and getting them to buy into your vision is really important. And also the other aspect of simply just kind of course alignment. If we're not thinking through why every single assignment is important to bringing out those major course outcomes, we may or may not be actually doing good work in the classroom. So those two aspects I think connect really, really well with transparency. And the what, the how, the why, I think those are really easy to remember. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and one benefit that I really saw in my own work was just the centralization of all sorts of information that I had with assignments that was scattered in my syllabus, in my schedule, in Canvas, in my rubric, in my prompt. They were in all these different places, and so I would get frustrated. I would think, I told them. I had told them exactly what I wanted, and the due date was right there, and this was right here, and Now it's all on this assignment sheet that I give them. So, they have a place for their name and their due date. Then I have the prompt. Then I have the rubric, which they get to be a little bit of a part of, which helps them engage in this metacognitive, awareness. And then I get into the purpose and the task and the criteria for success, and it's all centralized rather than them having to read my mind and figure out where all of this different information and all these different expectations are stored.
Yeah, and I think the key word you said there is expectations. We have the expectation that, yeah, they grabbed the due date from the syllabus and they grabbed the how many points it was worth and the rubric from this other, all these disparate sources. But I think one of the approaches with TILT is that it's, get the idea of just-in-time information, that it's giving you that information just when you need it, all at the same place. And I like that idea. And I like what you said about that it's kind of leveling the playing field. It's taking some of those things that we assumed that they understood or that they know how to get and just putting it all out on the table. So what are some of the specific things that you've tried? So a lot of times when we're working with faculty, we like to tell faculty, hey, try one thing, like a +1 approach we call it. What's one thing you can do? What are some of those one things that faculty could try in the spirit of being more transparent or leveling that playing field in their assignment design?
If they have the task, adding one more thing. Something I think the easiest one to do is the idea about expectations, and especially what we call it rubrics or criteria or samples. There's a lot of different ways that we can show students what we're expecting of them. I think that is probably the next logical step, but I think it's one that a lot of people are already doing. They're not only telling students what they're supposed to be doing, but how they're going to be assessed. And if you have those two down, I think the final frontier is probably that expectation of, or articulation of the reasons why. The knowledge and the skills and the abilities part of it. I think sometimes we know what those are, and for a lot of different reasons, we may not be asking students to ask those questions. It may be sort of you're doing this because I'm telling you to, or because I know and I haven't necessarily made it really clear to you. So there might be some reasons why faculty haven't done that in the past, but that is the next thing. And if we can articulate how it connects to the course outcomes, it's a lot easier to sell it as relevant information. It's also a great test for us to be able to know whether or not the information is useful. And if we can do that little checklist, I think it really, really helps. So I think kind of building on those, but the task is always going to be the most important. I think the next one would be that, how am I doing this well? And then finally, that why am I doing this at all? It can be a challenge, and it might be a really useful, thoughtful kind of reflection in my mind.
Yeah, and I have a couple different things that you might do. So the first thing I would suggest, and I think one of the most important things that I put on my transparently designed assignment is that, and speaking of +1, in applied linguistics, we talk about Krashen's input hypothesis, which he calls I +1. And it's essentially where you're at +1, not I +100. So that's what I say. It says, do focus on what we're learning. Remember, this is I +1, not I +100. So my students know that they're supposed to challenge themselves. They also know that they're not supposed to push themselves so far beyond that they're not doing this assignment anymore. So that really helped me help my students find the sweet spot for what it is that they're doing in our assignments. And then also I would say, just as an instructor, just do one assignment. And it took me, I think about an hour and a half to build my first assignment. And I had some examples from Angela. I found some other examples online. And then, like I mentioned earlier, it was really then, I had sort of a format on my Word document. I also had a lot of my criteria for success and things that were really easily transferred to other assignments. So I did not do this all at once. I started with one assignment and went from there.
And adding on that, this incredible results that they've seen from all these research studies, the magic number that they had faculty do was only 2 more transparent assignments compared to a control class. That was their experimental thing. It's not like students need all of this. They're building in academic confidence, a sense of belonging, as well as all these other kinds of skills that employers really find valuable: communication, teamwork, problem solving, critical thinking, all these types of things. All those things were increased because teachers made only 2 assignments more transparent. So it's not this huge huge kind of hill that people have to climb, I think, in order to get results. It is not a whole course redesign, and that's what I really appreciate is the small, fairly replicable. I mean, if you're talking, an hour and a half, it's not like you're going to spend weeks and weeks redesigning everything. It's just adding to those assignments that we already have and making them better and stronger and, of course, more transparent.
And I will add that you save time down the road, I think. I mean, what I've discovered was that I was spending a lot of time sort of correcting misunderstood directions rather than just correcting their Spanish or, so I get to leave much more valuable feedback, but just the being bogged down in the so-and-so didn't do this right and how do I help them with that issue, I spend way less time on that kind of grading and way more time being really engaged with them and really, giving feedback that's interesting for them and, interesting for me as the instructor.
Interesting. Let's talk about results a little bit. What have you found after implementing this into some of your assignments?
Yeah, I started with, we do 2 compositions in my classes each quarter, and we call them compositions because there's not a better word for it in Spanish. So students get freaked out when they hear, all right, we have a composition coming up. And really what it is it's an extended written practice of current topics. Well, I was able to put that in my prompt, and that just resolved a lot of anxiety right out of the get-go. So those were the 2 that I started with because those were the 2 that my students were having the most trouble with, the same kind of assignment. And so that was probably, a year and a half ago even.
I think so.
Yeah, a year and a half ago that I first did my first TILT revision. And I have not had a student miss this assignment since, which is absolutely incredible to me because it would be my, my students that were more at risk for whatever reason that would miss the assignment and they wouldn't come to class for the peer review or they wouldn't turn it in because they didn't know how to approach it. Well, now we have sort of a playbook for how to approach it, and I have not had one student miss this assignment for any reason in the last year and a half.
Huge.
Yeah, it's huge because it was, I would say, per assignment, so again, this is 2 per quarter, between 2 and 4 students each time.
So are you thinking that students were looking at the instructions and just kind of seeing it as too daunting and then just blowing it off, or just not blowing it off in a sense of I can't do it, but I'm so overwhelmed by this project that I'm just going to not address it?
I think they were overwhelmed. I mean, I think it really helps, again, that I have all the information that they need centralized. They see what they're earning points for. So they see that, I always point this out for them, the way I grade it is that they don't lose points for making mistakes. They earn points for doing it this way and doing that and having this. So they see, okay, well, I could do that, check that box. And I actually get a lot of these back because they turn them in as a cover sheet for their assignment, and they've checked off the different things to make sure that they're achieving, what is expected of them.
Right.
So it's just been a real synthesis of so many different things that I think has come together to be a real recipe for success for my students with that assignment in particular.
And
Excellent.
that basic idea about combating the sort of, I don't know of a better word than the sort of imposter syndrome that I think a lot of students walk into our campus with. I think there's so many returning students, so many students who are first generation, who've had very unsuccessful academic experiences in the past in particular. And I swear they leave like 1 foot out in the parking lot when they step on campus. And they're just looking for a reason to confirm their worst fear that they don't belong here. And when you spell something out so clearly, it doesn't matter if you know what a composition has looked like in the past or something like that. When you give them all the details, those students who are least likely to ask the questions because they don't want to look stupid, and also least likely to have the information to begin with, they're the ones who benefit so much from having everything clearly articulated. And I think that's one of the reasons why we see those huge, huge closes in those equity gaps, because not only does everybody do better, but the students who are most at risk are the ones who are actually making the biggest kinds of leaps and advances in those areas, especially like academic confidence, sense of belonging. I mean, those are the reasons that people persist.
Yeah, those were the things that really stood out to me as I was doing the research in this area, is all those kind of those non-academic things, that sense of belonging, and just giving them a little bit of confidence that, oh yeah, I can do this, and that, like you said, those were only 2 assignments that in the studies that the instructors only changed those 2 assignments, but they saw improvement across the course, not just the 2 assignments, and I thought that was interesting. And it's interesting you say that with students on ground. If you're teaching online, that's even multiplied, that those students don't feel like they belong or they don't get it, it's very easy to assume all the other students get it and I don't belong here, and I've seen in some of the transparency framework that instructors will even say this is a hard part, or students often struggle with this, just putting that out there. Students struggle with this, here's what it means. And so when the student sees it and they think that they're going to struggle with it, they know that they're in the same boat with everybody else, and it at least establishes at least we're all suffering together, kind of mentality. But again, improving that sense of belonging and stuff. Can we talk a little bit about the samples? And one of the aspects that we read about is giving samples of work, both samples of good work and maybe samples of poor work. Here's what to avoid, those kind of things. Have you tried that, and how do you see that working?
Yeah, so I've tried that in a couple different ways. I have, always with student permission, I've given examples of some written work that they've done, and then I've also given an example of a recorded presentation for an online class that was done. And they pay attention to them because I get a lot of, especially with that presentation, I get a lot of presentations very much in the image of that presentation. And I'm glad for it because it was an A presentation at that level. It was very well structured, and they follow that structure, and they've improved a lot. And one thing that I did last quarter for the first time after having a conversation with Angela was I did sort of a mock presentation. I just threw one together myself, and I talked them through it using a screencast with a camera. And I said, okay, on this slide, this is what I want for your first slide, and this is what needs to be on it. And you can see this here. All right, to the next slide, this is what I want. And we went all the way through it, all the way to our final slide, and they just, again, I ended up giving so much feedback at just a much higher level last quarter, even with that additional transparent video, rather than, oh, you forgot to have a page at the beginning that with your word key to help your audience, because it's in Spanish, so they have 10 words in Spanish with their equivalents in English to help their audience follow along, because we do peer review. So it's just the more that I'm able, and sometimes I kind of feel like I'm overdoing it, like, is this too much? But the level of the work just incrementally, has been improving as I give them more and more in this, transparency framework.
And as a literature and composition teacher, I've always used samples, and I always posted those for my online classes, but it wasn't until very recently that I realized that there was this huge gap. In my on-ground classes, I would talk through those student samples where I would talk about what the strengths were and really try to, especially early on, teach them to look at a paper through that lens of my grading criteria, which I always had access to, with a couple of key things early on, and really try to talk them through my expectations. And now that the technology is so much easier to do that and annotate the way that I would like to in the papers, I'm able to share some much better resources with that last aspect of how to do an assignment well, to really do more than just, here's a sample that you can read and look at, or here's a grading criteria list, a rubric or something like that. But actually being able to talk to your online students and share that kind of thing is a really, really good resource that really starts to kind of bring up the level of those online and hybrid resources that are really equivalent to the kind of thing I'm doing in a face-to-face class.
Yeah, that criteria piece is a huge component. I really like your idea on the checklist on how to earn the points for this. Not here's what I'm going to take away, but here's how you're going to earn your points for this assignment. Do you ever feel that by using student samples or providing too much assistance, you're almost hand-holding them through the project, and they're losing, some sort of aspect of creative thinking or problem solving on figuring it out on their own?
I don't, but again, my training as a composition teacher has meant that sharing student work on other topics, like other writing, so if we're writing about X, I'm going to show them something about Y, so that we can talk through structure, talk through support in a more theoretical way, because they're not exactly having to copy this. But thankfully, the structure of an essay is kind of the structure of an essay. There's not a lot of different ways around it. So by showing multiple student examples especially and a variety of ways to approach it, it can really, really help students, I think, see the many different ways that you can write an effective thesis. I would never show them just one. I would want to show them lots and lots of different ways so that they can get some of their own creativity still in there and still meet those expectations. So it's a tough one though. I can understand how people are concerned that showing an example is going to limit students. So really trying to perhaps provide more than one can help combat that concern or that fear.
Mm-hmm. And that's something, you know, that I was worried about, you know, in the beginning. But I just feel like in eliminating a lot of the guesswork, I really get to see what they're capable of, like more of their, you know, self or their creativity actually ultimately comes through, you know, when they're not just trying to guess what I want. They know what I want, right? And then they can, you know, take it from there in their own unique way. And I do think, you know, giving more examples would be a good thing. You know, in my online class in particular, like I'm looking for the next one that I think is, you know, quality to, you know, shareable quality with a student that would be willing to share. And that's, you know, something that we're always improving, right? So something I'll be looking for.
It's almost like a snowball effect. As your students do better, then you get better samples, and you can give them more and better samples, then they can do better the next term again.
I'm thinking back to that presentation that I went to then, because that is a topic that people talk about in terms of faculty pushback, is if I give them something, they won't have a chance to create it on their own. And so there was a group of faculty from another university then who actually had a student group come and talk through an assignment and get their, they sort of did like a line by line. What are you thinking? Talk it out loud. What's your response here? And when the faculty said, I really want you guys to come up with something totally unique on your own, the student said, well, then just tell us that. So that's a way that you can approach this, is simply, I'm not giving you a specific, but the purpose of this assignment and part of your evaluation is how creatively you approach this. By articulating that and not just leaving it blank, students realize that if they're struggling or they're going, I'm not sure how to approach this, once again, they're not stupid. They haven't missed something. That's part of the assignment. And so the more that we're able to just simply be transparent about our purpose and our assessment, even if it is, I'm not telling you what you're supposed to do, students understand that and can actually respond to it in a much, much better way than simply just leaving that off and they're going, but you didn't tell me what I'm supposed to do. I have no idea. I'm afraid to ask. Or again, this just reconfirms I'm not college material. And they'll walk away and simply not do it, which is the worst case scenario in that situation.
Yeah, and one thing I've really, you know, used the transparency framework to bring into the discussion with my students is that mistakes, at least in our area, are a very good thing because you learn from them. Nobody ever learned to speak a foreign language without making thousands and thousands of mistakes, and hundreds of those are probably embarrassing, right? It's like a rite of passage. It's part of the deal. It's part of the learning process. So, you know, when I mentioned the I+1 earlier, I'm like, you have to get yourself into that I+1 zone. If you're not in that zone, like if you're not making mistakes, you're not in that zone and you're not growing. So we've had this whole discussion of if you're not making mistakes, you're not doing it right in that sense because you're not pushing yourself. So I've integrated that into my rubric. Actually, we have what we call push yourself points. So everything's out of 100 and 10, there's a line, or push yourself points. Students are very honest. I've had as low as 3, and a lot of them 6, 7, and then some of them are like 100, or 10. You know, I really pushed myself. So, but it's really interesting to see them be more aware of, am I getting into that growth zone?
That's just, you know, building in that metacognitive growth mindset approach even in your assignment design as well. Taking tilt to the next step.
Yeah, it's really flexible.
I think so.
Yeah. It's very flexible. And that's one thing I've loved about it is I'll pull something here and I'll add something here, and just to and see what works and see what doesn't, and meet the needs of each individual assignment.
Well, we'd like to thank you guys for coming. Do you have any last words, any last thoughts you'd like to share with us?
It's easier than you think. I mean, I love this idea about just doing one small extra thing and building on it, because that is the way that I think real transformation happens.
And then try it. If you find that it's not a good fit for your style or for your class or for your students, then don't do it again. But it's worth a shot, and I think that most people would be impressed with the results that they see.
All right, well, thank you guys for joining us.
Yeah.
Thank you.